Hi, my name is Edward Brice. I'm the Senior Vice President of Marketing for Lumension, and thank you for joining the Optimal Security Videocast. We're continuing our discussion on compliance and risk management, and joining me today are two distinguished gentlemen in that field. Brandon Dunlap of Brightfly, who's a Managing Director and Research Analyst. Brightfly is an advisory and consulting firm in the IT GRC market space. And to my left is Jeff Hughes, who is with Lumension and heads up he is our Director of Solution Marketing. And Jeff brings a storied past in IT GRC. So gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to start off today by, I had just picked up a news release where the FTC just issued a consent order regarding GLBA privacy rule. And in that order, which they issued to James B. Nutter and Company, where they basically issued a consent to that company for having inadequate security safeguards on information, requiring that company for the next 20 years to comply with various types of monitoring and audit type of activities. It seems, gentlemen, that a lot of companies are struggling with this, but there's a cost of not complying. So I just wanted to get your sense, starting out, what's some of the challenges you see, and Brandon, I'll start with you. What are some of the challenges you see that companies are having in this space?
Well, it's interesting, the point to your FTC consent order, that particular case, the two items that jumped out most to me were, one, they didn't have a documented security program, and two, they did not adequately assess the risks to their customer information. I think those are two pretty big challenges for a lot of companies, especially as you're moving towards the mid-market. You know, documentation seems to be the thing that always goes out the door in a development cycle, and I think in looking at security operations and the impact to the organization from a compliance perspective, they're just as important.
Great.
I think also regulatory compliance is being stepped up by federal agencies and governments and so on. So we're starting to see penalties increase, and so these companies are getting hit pretty hard when they're not being in compliance.
So in a lot of my meetings, especially with the smaller companies, I think maybe this is the wrong perception to have, but we always sort of think that these large companies have staffs and experts. But yet, smaller companies also have the same compliance and audit requirements as well. And I think in that context, I hear a lot about this notion of the audit tax or the audit burden. Any thoughts on that in terms of, I guess I'll ask you, Jeff.
Sure.
What are some of the challenges that companies are sort of facing there?
Well, first of all, the audit tax is kind of a term that's used that is all-encompassing for the costs that a company might incur to be compliant. It's the time they spend, the staff they have to devote to particular compliance initiatives. It's the money they spend on buying products. And so companies, as more and more compliance and regulations start to come around for companies, they're starting to see an increase of this audit tax or this burden of having to perform more and more audits. So years ago it started out the company had to only perform maybe 1 or 2 audits. Depending on the size of the company, now they're having to perform 5, 6, maybe 10 audits a year, and there's an increasing cost associated with every single audit.
So no one likes taxes. So why don't we talk a little bit about how to reduce those taxes? And Brandon, I'd like to sort of ask you, I mean, no one can avoid paying taxes, right? What's sort of the first step that you would recommend to a company and how to maybe reduce the burden of that tax?
Well, we saw the 7th annual Sarbanes-Oxley survey conducted by FEI actually showed that despite reductions in control footprint, despite all the efforts to streamline compliance activities, the company still saw an increase in costs of around 5.25%, somewhere around there. A lot of that was due to additional hourly fees, shall we say, on the audit side. Those fees actually rose as well as part of kind of inflation. So I think that the first step is to look at the audit cycle itself and say, where are the inefficiencies there? This is an opportunity for an organization to actually kind of squeeze some of the costs out of that just by applying some basic management discipline around working smarter, not necessarily harder.
So really take a look at your process first versus just jumping into the audit, really understand what is my process and perhaps where I'm maybe doing things twice or 3 times where I might be able to do them.
Absolutely. Peter Drucker actually said efficiency is doing things right, effectiveness is doing them well. And I think that if we just get better at our game, shall I say, we can probably reap a significant amount of cost savings out of the equation altogether.
Okay. Just to follow on to that, Jeff, it seems that, and I've heard in my conversations that, you know, it would be great if I can comply or do my audits that I can hit a lot of different compliance regs at the same time. Is there a way that companies can harmonize this to a greater extent?
Sure. So kind of following along with what Brandon's saying, a lot of companies are not approaching compliance from more of a top-down perspective. What's happening is they're addressing compliance initiatives in a siloed format from one business unit to another, each one of them trying to comply with their particular regulations or initiatives that they have. And so what a company needs to do is find products that will help them prove compliance by doing scans of their network once or on an ongoing basis, and then being able to provide reports to each of those particular compliance initiatives. So rather than having a product over here to do one compliance initiative and a product over here to do another, you find products that can do all of those, meet all of those compliance initiatives or provide information for both. So if you have a top-down approach, talking about the process to compliance, and look at it from the standpoint of what are the controls and regulations we need to be concerned about for all of our initiatives, that's a better way to approach compliance than on a one-off ad hoc type of basis. And that's really what we're trying to get companies to think about and move towards.
Yeah, I was just meeting with a regional healthcare firm, and I think the issue there was with healthcare companies that they're taking credit cards. Mm-hmm. They also have HIPAA, which is a major regulation. Are there ways, or is there a coming together where PCI sort of meets HIPAA, or is there a place where I can focus, where I can gain greater efficiencies? And I'm just using those two as an example, Brandon.
Sure.
Any way that I can look differently at my compliance regulations and try to gain additional?
Well, to Jeff's point, I think you're looking at wanting to essentially assess your organization only one time and then deliver the appropriate information to your various stakeholders regardless of the audit activity that you're trying to support. That's absolutely a critical step in streamlining and again, squeezing some costs out of this particular problem. Interestingly enough, over in the UK, I had the luxury of being over there very recently. Everybody there is seeming to attach onto one particular framework. In this case, it's the ISO, the new revised ISO standard, and thinking that if I can adhere to that I have covered kind of the gamut of my security requirements. When you look at something like PCI and HIPAA here in the United States, the end goal is essentially the same. You could very easily replace cardholder data with PHI, EPHI, right? And so looking for those commonalities, looking for those areas of overlap across regulatory requirements or industry mandates is definitely key in reducing your overhead.